Welcome to a Wonder Junkie podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Anderson.
Nobody knows what's going on. Nobody knows. Nobody has the faintest idea. The best guesses are lies. You may be sure of it.
All right. Well, thank you for joining me today.
You're very welcome.
Absolutely. It looks like you have quite a fascinating life, and I looked at your biography online, and I would love to have you introduce yourself to the people that have never been exposed to who you are and what you're doing, because it sounds like you're doing a lot of things for many years here. So,
It's true. My name is Andy Morgan. Actually, when I publish, I go by Charles A. Morgan III, but people who know me call me Andy. In my career, I was a French language major in college and then went to med school and specialized in psychiatry and in forensic psychiatry. So when I came to Yale, I was working with something called the National Center for Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder. And our mandate at the time, way back in 1990, was to try and figure out if that illness or whatever it was something significantly different from things like major depression or panic disorder or maybe bipolar disorder, different kind of psychiatric illnesses. It was sort of a new label at the time. And we really didn't know whether or not it just looked and sounded different, or if it was just a variant of depression for people who'd been exposed to traumatic events and then suffered from an array of symptoms. So for the 1990s, I started out checking people's boo reflex, when you jump, when you hear a sudden noise, kind of like in a scary movie. And it's called startle. And historically, it's one of the most longstanding symptoms. Like you can read it in Sassoon's poetry from World War I about veterans who jump when they hear loud noises. But the cool thing in a neuroscience standpoint is that it is about 8 neurons long, and it is only increased by a unique emotion of fear. So it became an objective way to measure an emotional response. And so my early work was in looking at how we acquire and extinguish fear-conditioned memories as measured by our boo reflex. And along the way, I think by about, I don't know, 1996, I was a little bored just doing clinical stuff. So I specialized in history of medicine and science and looked at government documentary and feature film on combat fatigue from World War II as a way of examining how was authoritative knowledge constructed. So how did we inform the public? What was wrong with veterans when they were coming home from World War II, or what ailed them? And then in the late 90s, we felt like we discovered a number of things that were different in neurobiologically in people with PTSD compared to other patient groups, specifically that there seemed to be an abnormality in their sympathetic nervous system, sort of that fight, flight, fear response, and how easily it was triggered. But we didn't have a war going on right at the time. So everything we knew is from a retrospective sort of interview, sort of looking backwards in time for people who aren't familiar with science studies. And although that teaches us something, it doesn't really let us know all the variables that might explain something, because people's recall over what's happened in the past can differ, it can vary over time. So we didn't know if the anomalies that we were measuring in people with PTSD were things that had made them more vulnerable to getting it, or whether or not they were a side effect of the illness. So, for example, if you have diabetes, for example, it's dysregulated control of blood sugar, but a side effect is that it can damage neurons. And so people get numbness in their feet, or men may get erectile dysfunction, things like that. But it's not really part of having diabetes. It's a side effect of it. Or whether or not things like startle and abnormal surges of adrenaline are really the pathophysiology of post-traumatic stress disorder. And so I started looking around because I was figuring, well, we have to do something prospective to look forward in time and make predictions. And I got invited. I'd been a former Navy doc before I joined the VA, and I got invited by the U.S. government to start using their program called survival school training as my lab. Because in the laboratory at the university, we can do a number of things really well. We can control every variable, right? But we can't really create stress that might be equal to somebody getting mugged or being sexually assaulted or fearing for their life and something like that. So they said, come and study survival school. And it's really code of conduct training, but it's very intense. So people have a classroom phase and then they're put out on evasion. They try and evade the enemy and then they're captured and made mock POWs. So my early work in the late 90s was just establishing whether or not that would be a valid place to study stress. Like, was it really stressful enough to be able to compare to real world traumatic events? And the short story is it was. It was sort of, we measured some of the highest surges in our stress hormones and adrenaline in humans and looking at special operations folks who were being interrogated or waterboarded and things like that in that kind of training. And that turned into like a 25-year career of looking at high intensity stress, and it morphed along the way. Um, I suddenly found myself in the middle of looking at eyewitness identification, looking at eyewitness memory for under stress, because my colleague, the professor who trained me, Steve Southwick, he and I had published a paper in 1996 that traumatic memories change in veterans. They change what they remember. Things like, yes, I was shot to no, I wasn't shot. So really, really important things that you wouldn't think would change in somebody's memory.
Mm.
And then, yeah, so I had to testify at The Hague. And then, once you do something like that, then attorneys get your name. And so that pushed me down the lane of also doing forensic psychiatry in addition to neuroscience. And that's the discipline of psychiatry where I'm mainly hired by an attorney, either a defense attorney or a prosecuting attorney in a criminal case, to educate the court in some way or the jury about how do you evaluate memory for high stress events, or how to think about how people's thinking changes under high stress. Um, yeah, so and then that's sort of evolved from there, and then in the 2003, I was recruited by the CIA, and I became a medical intelligence officer for a number of years. And my main function was trying to help the government evaluate sort of scientific technology that purports to detect deception. Because I was one of the guys in my unit who had experience doing human studies. And I then found myself discovering, I guess I'm a guy who knows a lot about detecting deception, although I never planned on that. That was my role for the government. And then in the around 2013, 14, I decided traveling back and forth to DC was, like tiring. So I resettled, for my main life here in New Haven, Connecticut, and sort of divide between teaching at the university and doing research, and doing forensics. So yeah, it's been really, really kind of interesting and varied. I didn't plan it. I think my rule in life was I'd like to do something meaningful and I want to do something that's interesting. And so so I teach my students, I look at opportunities for where you can learn something new and try and enhance our current understanding of something we don't really know much about. So yeah.
I love that.
Oh,
No,
in a nutshell, yeah.
it's
Yeah.
amazing what curiosity does when you just follow it and what it leads
Yeah.
to, and then you find new things, and then it just keeps taking you down these avenues, and it's amazing to hear your journey. It's pretty cool.
Well, it's funny. I think some people don't realize that when you do science, from my perspective, it's really a fun experience of exploring, like in a curious way. Because many of the things you hypothesize don't turn out to be true, but you learn what's not, what can't account for something. Um, and I think that it's a little like puzzle solving. Like some people wondered, they've asked me before, like, well, you like intelligence analysis and you do forensics and you do science. There, there's a similarity between them in looking at it like a criminal case or something where I evaluate data, and you don't always have all the answers to everything, right? So you have to put the pieces of a puzzle together and come up with a story that makes the most sense within a reasonable degree of medical or scientific certainty in order to help educate a judge or a jury. But there are there are pieces that are missing, and so you're trying to do the best you can at figuring something out. And I think there's a really fun aspect of that to me, trying to figure something out and then figure out why that explanation is probably wrong. So try a new one and see if you can find one that works better
Mm.
than one. Yeah.
I love
So
that. So with
yeah,
deception detection, it seems like you became a really big asset with that, just based on all of your experience and what you gained an understanding of. What are some of the core components of that when you can tell if someone's being deceptive? I was reading a lot on your website about even heart rate variability and things like that, or
yeah,
sinus arrhythmias and
yeah. So the field of detecting deception is pretty broad, right? But at its core, the question that always comes up is if someone says, "I don't know anything about that," do they really know something about it? And are they just so it's like a lie of omission. They're going, "I know this and this, but I don't know anything about that." Or people tell a lie like an alibi where they're saying, yes, I did something that they didn't do. So we have lies of omission and lies of, you could say, of sort of fabrication. So they're telling a story. And there's a number of ways historically, way back in the 1890s, when there was an interest in truth serum at the time, the idea was somehow by giving you this drug, you could bring truth to the surface, that somehow inside the person and you can make it come out, right? Um, but I think for a long time, at least since the 1920s, the thinking, and this is what informed sort of the development of the polygraph or the polygraph as we know it today, was the idea that when people are being deceptive, if it is not just for fun, just lying for the fun of it, like having a party game, that it's a threat and that it activates your fear and alarm system, your sympathetic nervous system, just like a real threat in your environment might. And so the idea is that when people lie, there's a change in their heart rate or their breathing rate or their skin conductance. But those are side effects of your sympathetic nervous system firing. And so one big model scientifically about detecting deception has been, it's called that fear arousal, fear and alarm hypothesis. That's how we try and detect if someone's lying. And so a large number of studies try and assess, are there changes in the heart rate, changes in the breathing rate? There was some people look at voice stress. Is there a change in the vibration of the vocal cords? So when we look at the sound, when people are lying versus telling the truth, but they're all rooted in this idea that the lie, if it's activating your fear and alarm system, should produce a physiology or a physiological response that looks different than the truth. Um, One of the problems with that sort of model is one of the reasons why things like the polygraph are not admissible in court. Um, because back in sort of 30s, 40s, and 50s, if women had suffered sexual assault, they were put on a polygraph and then asked about it. And so if you think about it from like a post-traumatic stress standpoint, if someone's been threatened and it's a fear conditioned memory, then asking them to talk about it activates their fear and alarm system so that many people who are innocent look guilty uh, because they look more nervous or reactive to the questions that are threatening. And we call that a false alarm or a false positive. And in courts, sort of the ruling by the court has been that so that we don't falsely accuse people, um, that false alarm rate is too high for it to be sort of used and presented in court, that it would be misleading to the court or to the jury for that. So that's one of the problems. So it is true that some people, when they lie, they experience changes in their sympathetic nervous system. Lots of people don't. So for people who don't experience guilt or who are lying because it's the right thing for them to do, I think that's my job. Like if I'm working undercover or working for intelligence or doing something, you might lie and say, no, I believe wholeheartedly in the lie. And you might not then experience that idea about guilt or anxiety or something about it. And so you might not look alarmed at all. So there's been a second model that was used to look at detecting deception, and that's called the cognitive load model, meaning that it requires more mental work to tell a lie than to tell the truth. One exception might be the type of lie we call the Ronnie Reagan lie, like just, I don't know. It's like 2 and 3 year olds that go, I don't know. But to tell a reasonably complicated, believable lie, we think requires more mental activity because if I'm gonna lie to you, I have to remember the story I need to tell you. which means I'm also remembering what really happened. I have to monitor to make sure I don't let anything leak over or give away what might give away my story. And I have to monitor you to see if you're believing what I tell you so I can make corrections and reassure you if you don't look like you're believing the story. Whereas for most people, if they're telling the truth, they don't have those other concerns. So in that hypothesis, there are some things you would expect. So, for example, in thinking harder, it produces a change in skin conductance or in heart rate variability that are the opposite of the changes you would see from a sympathetic model. So, for example, in one model, skin conductance goes up, and in the other one, it goes down. So it's been a really productive scientific model. And I would say the bulk of the scientific evidence in terms of trying to detect deception suggests that using the model around looking for indicators of more mental work may be more useful in the long run. So a lot of the work that I've done in either of those models, you could look at brain imaging, you can look at physiology in the periphery, you can look at body language, body movement, or you can look at speech. And in speech, we think of the words that people say, and then the non-word fillers like the hesitations and things like that. And so in either model, the fear and alarm model or the cognitive load model, you can measure all those things, but some of the predictions are different. And for me, when I had deployed with Doc Hazlett, we were trying to find things that were practical and useful to use to vet people. So in the world of sort of in the criminal world, the police run into people who always say, "No, it wasn't there, it didn't do it." Those lies of omission. In the world of intelligence, the dilemma is a little bit different. It's usually people saying, "I know something you should know. Pay me. I can get you information for your government." And in some ways, in some regions of the world, we don't, we just assume everybody's lying, that no one's telling the truth to everybody. And we're trying to figure out what part of the story is true, sometimes more than what part of the story is false. And uh, and there were some consequences to that during the war after 9/11, the war in Iraq. Sometimes the truthful people who were coming to provide information to the US were more nervous than the liars who were just trying to tell us something that they could get money for, because the truthful people were really putting their life at risk by going and trying to tell the Americans something. So very often they would fail the polygraphs or something like that because they're terrified more than the other ones. Like, well, you don't pay me, then nobody kills me when I go home, but I just didn't get any money from the US. So I was interested in something that might be good at sorting true claims from false claims, and also something that might be more practical. You can't really take an MRI scanner, in parts of the world, and physiology is messy. Skin conduct changes, depending on sort of how sweaty it is, your skin color, yeah, how much melatonin. So I and my colleagues, we focused a lot on what people have to say, and we did that within the context of a particular kind of interviewing. A lot of people think I came up with it. I didn't. Part of what I do is find something interesting and then see what I can do to use it. I had found a paper from a researcher in Spain who she had published a paper basically saying my experiment failed. But her observation had been that when she was paying people to lie, and she was using this memory retrieval method called cognitive interviewing, the interview didn't work. And I thought, well, that's really interesting. So cognitive interviewing, it's a fancy term, but it's a way of interviewing that was developed in the late 80s, early 90s as a way of getting the best eyewitness recall from people. Oh, that's my happy dog out there. Getting the best eyewitness recall from people without contaminating the recall. So we know that when the police ask you questions or your friends ask you questions, sometimes that can change our recall and our memory. So Ed Geiselman and Ron Fisher developed an interview technique called the cognitive interview that was meant to enhance memory recall without distorting it. And it's pretty straightforward. You might say, all right, let's say I'm interested in what you did between 8 and 8:30 this morning. I would say, so I'm interested in your memory between starting at 8:30 until 9 o'clock, just everything you remember going on, everything you did, and so start there until you get to 9 o'clock and just tell me everything that's in your memory, even if it's trivial or insignificant. If it's in your memory, go ahead and mention it. And then you shut up.
Mm.
Person gets to stop. And then when they're done, you use a technique called mnemonic prompts. And that's because human memory doesn't work like your phone, doesn't work like the movie file on your phone. Our memory works by association. And that's why sometimes when you smell things, you go, oh, this reminds me of something, or you taste something, or you hear a song and you remember something. Um, or if you've had a really busy day and you can't remember where you parked your car, you start going backwards in your head or where you left your keys, trying to figure out where you were. And so what we ask people is we try and jog their memory. So after they've told that first story, we say, that's great. So go back to the beginning. And this time, tell me everything that's in your visual memory, everything that got recorded by your brain through your eyes. Start at the beginning. And then after they're done, we say, what about auditory memory? And then we might say, what was the experience like? Or start with the very last thing in your memory and tell me what's in your memory right before that. Right before that. In other words, walk me backwards. And that jogs people's memory and they remember more things. So the
Mm.
story expands. So in the world of detecting deception, here's how this plays out. Um, we find that people who are motivated to lie, they do a number of things differently than people who are just telling the truth.
Mm.
People who are telling the truth, they make more reversals in their statement. They make a few more errors because they're thinking in their memory and correcting as they go. People who are lying, uh, they tend to believe that people will know they're lying if they're inconsistent or if they make mistakes. So they tell their story and they stick to it. So every time you go back over it, we don't get much variation and nothing much expands. And so, in a very simple way to look at that, we can do a word count, just count the number of words that came out of their mouth, and a unique word count. So that's just all the unique words that they said. So if you say, one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind, there's 10 words but there's only 8 unique words because 1 and 4 were used twice.
Mm.
And here's the really geeky thing. Increased cognitive load reduces lexical diversity. So you get it reduces sort of that frequency use of unique words. And so it's a really cheap way of looking at stories. But the computer, when we sort people by that, is usually right between 80 and 90% of the time about what's a genuine versus a non-genuine story. So by no means not perfect, but certainly it's up in the highest ranges that we get for detecting deception when people are having a conversation. So it's for me, I've been fascinated by it, and then I got into a totally different method of detecting deception. That came out of the old ESP experiments between the Soviet Union and the US, um, called forced choice testing.
Mm.
It's a totally different model, not based on sympathetic arousal, not based on thinking harder. When we say you can ask people whether they know something or they don't know something, but it's built on the idea that knowledge changes your guessing and that humans cannot approximate chance. They don't know how to do it in their head. So, for example, in psych, we use this currently for memory deficits. But before, when we didn't have any way of telling whether someone could hear or not, and they go, my hearing's damaged, you owe me a lot of money. Well, then we could put headphones on them and say, well, we need to let the disability board know how much the government or your military experience or whatever has damaged your hearing. So we're just going to play some tones and just tell me what it is. And you say it's going to be A, B, C, or D. And you push the button, you go, what is it? And they go, I don't know, I didn't hear it. And you go, well, just guess. So for the person who really can't hear, if you do about 100 trials and there's 4 tones, they get about 25% of them right. The person who's lying is in a dilemma because they're motivated to persuade you that they can't hear. So they know they have to get something wrong to prove their point that they can't hear. But since we don't tell them how many times we're going to play the tone, they don't know how many to get right and how many to get wrong. So, for example, if you do that same thing with someone who's lying, they might get 2% of them right. Well, the cool part is you can say that's actually so far away from what you get by chance. We know you can actually hear.
Mm.
So we're learning something by how far off of the binomial prediction a person's behavior is. So it's a really geeky thing to do, and
Yeah.
it's been a lot of fun. And we're still trying to explore the ways that that might be useful in investigations. We just published a paper last year on trying to see if you could find a cell hiding in a group of people. We'd done an experiment with the Connecticut State Troopers, and we got permission for their class before their final to create a cell out of the 64 people. We created a cell of 7 people and said, "Here's the key to the exam. Don't give anybody up." Right. And then what we did is we had everybody in the class interviewed, and a person would sit down. So we took a picture of everybody and we made a PowerPoint slide that only had 2 pictures on a slide, and we never put males with females. And we just say, we think there might be a cell planning on cheating on the exam. Do you know anything about it? And people go, no. And then you say, great, I don't either. But of these 2 people, who do you think might be a member of the cell? And so the hypothesis would be is that you wouldn't point to yourself on the slide when you came up, right? And that you shouldn't point to other cell members. So if you say out of 64 people, all other things being equal, and it's a 50-50 chance on 2 of the slides, how many votes should you get? And you can calculate that. It's roughly half of them, plus or minus what we call the binomial distribution. And so we were interested in everybody who was at least below the predicted number. And the short story is, they're all at least down by more than 7. And then if you look at everybody who's down below the binomial prediction, and then look at who didn't pick who, you can identify the cell members in the group. There's a lot of people who don't get picked because they're just not popular or something, or people don't notice them. But then you can see, well, did they touch any of the other hot potato sort of people? So that's the very geeky thing
That's
I'm
awesome.
playing around with now about how much can you learn by asking people very simple questions, and they believe they're trying to be as helpful as possible, but their single answer can tell you things.
Mm.
Uh, yeah.
And it
So
seems like this information is so useful for other countries for security reasons and things like that. So is it always something where when you guys are learning about deception and really important features like this, that information and data, how protected is it or how hard is it to keep it from getting accessed by other companies or other people?
Well, so the method itself on forced choice testing has been around a long time to look at financial discrepancies. Like you can't call numbers into your head at the same rates that they would naturally occur. And so when people cook the books, the frequency distribution of the numbers is off. It's also been used to look at irregularities in voting.
Hmm.
When you get down to the last 2 digits, to see whether it's a random or non-random distribution, to see whether or not somebody's been stuffing the ballot box or something.
Mm.
So the method isn't a secret. What you would do is you wouldn't give your own database to someone else. That you would keep protected because then no one would know the actual frequency rate that a question's endorsed or not endorsed. But the methodology of asking everybody like one question, the Chinese have used that, and other countries have used it because most people don't feel like they're giving anything up by answering a very innocent question.
Hmm.
Uh, yeah, we were experimenting with that at SEER School. We wanted to see how well it would work with people in like mock captivity. And they were just saying whether they did or didn't recognize someone who might be working for the US, and they were all going to lie. And just by having everybody make one statement, you could go back and assemble who was probably the spy,
Mm.
uh, even though no one gave up any information. So it can be really deceptive, but other intelligence services are aware of it. I think, as far as I know right now, I know the Israelis have used it because I had talked to one of their security folks who learned it from us. Um, and then there's one of our other allies, I think, is using it. But what you wouldn't share would be your reference database around that. Yeah.
Got it. And then I'm fascinated with this truth serum idea. I know that was around
Yeah,
for a long time, especially even in the early like 60s and when the MK
yeah,
Ultra programs were going on. Some of the stuff that they were dabbling with was so nefarious and obviously, inappropriate to be experimenting on our own citizens. But
yeah.
see, I
Without
read,
telling
yeah,
you.
yeah. And then I read,
So,
did you read Chaos by chance, Tom
yeah,
O'Neill's? I
yeah,
actually had him on the podcast and I got really deep into his book, and it just leads to so many other
yeah.
things. It's not just Charles Manson. It led to like, wow, they were doing this on so many people, even the JFK assassination. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on hypnosis and
Yeah.
being able to implant memories or remove memories and what we have learned about that, or whether you are willing to speak about any of that and what you're allowed to
Yeah.
speak about.
Yeah. Actually, I would say there's very little of my research that I can't talk about.
Cool.
Had a couple of things that the government decided, I can't talk about, but this I can. The Well, so for hypnosis, clinical hypnosis, I was trained in that, and we were often looking at that about looking at finding out what people remembered, from the past and things. And the short story on it from a scientific standpoint was that memory is highly suggestible, and that just because whether you use a sodium amytal, like a drug interview, to like the truth serum or something to get people to relax and start talking, it was no guarantee that the memories were real. And I did a study, it's about a decade ago, a little more than a decade ago, where we created false memory in like 800 special operations guys. I was interested in, I'll back up. So Elizabeth Losowitz is a really, really wonderful person, famous professor for looking at sort of misinformation and how childhood memories are altered. And I met her in the early 90s because in the 80s, people were having the recovered memory syndrome cases where people would go to therapy, recover memories, and say, my parents killed someone, and the parents would be charged, or say I was abused, or there were, aliens and babies in blenders and those kinds of things. If you think about the McMartin preschool case
Yeah.
where people were arrested and, you know, there's supposed to be tunnels under the daycare center and there weren't. And since I was interested in PTSD at the time, we at the time believed that memory for traumatic events is relatively indelible. It's a more secure kind of memory than everyday memory. Turns out that's not true, but that's what we believed at the time. And I hadn't really paid any attention to that early recovered memory syndrome stuff because we're like, well, that's just a long time ago. And most cases in court are about somebody being assaulted like 2 days ago. And although people might believe, the police could play tricks on you in the way they asked a question that might change your memory for something that happened 30 years ago or, when you were five. I think most people go, yeah, that's not a stretch. It probably could change my memory. Most people wouldn't believe that from something 24 hours ago or 48 hours ago, if it was a life-threatening experience, that you wouldn't be correct. You said, nope, I saw him. That's the way he looks like. It was right here in my face. I got a good exposure to it, and I'll never forget the face, right? So once I had permission to actually take photographs at survival school, and we knew how stressful things were, I was able to actually video interrogations and then expose people to the different kinds of things that the police often do. So I had one condition where we didn't do anything to people's memory. And there were other ones where we just changed the way we asked the question. And then there was another group where we just showed them another picture. Or another one, we doctored videos, little early photoshopping in videos to see if we could change people's memory. And the short story was memory for highly traumatic events is not indelible. So over half the people were simply just wrong about who their interrogator was without doing misinformation, but highly confident that they were identifying their interrogator. They were just wrong.
Mm.
And then we found that by just changing the phrasing of a question, you could get profoundly different rates. For example, if you wanted to know if the interrogator wore glasses, you could say, "Did your interrogator wear glasses?" Now we also asked about weapons. Did they have a weapon? But you could just say, "Did they if so, did they have glasses? And if so, please describe them. When you ask the question that way, and none of the interrogators in that block had glasses, but when you asked it that way, about 10% of the soldiers would say, yes, my interrogator wore glasses. But if you said, um, um, before your interrogator began to beat you, did he or she like remove their glasses? And what were they, and what were they beating you up about? And then you came back and you go describe the glasses worn by your interrogator. A couple of questions later, we have a 90% endorsement rate of glasses. The same thing happened with weapons, which is a safety violation at Sears School. Nobody has any weapons. But if we said, when the interrogator wearing the weapon interrupted your interrogator and argued with them, what did they argue about? And the person would go, I don't know. Say somebody yelled at somebody. You go,
Mm,
great. Was there a flag in the room? Was there a telephone in the room? And then you say, oh, describe the weapon worn by your interrogator. If we did it that way, you could get, like 30% of them to describe the firearm, or the knife that the interrogator had. And
mm,
that's just with one question.
jeez. Wow.
So I think what I've learned over the years, it's really memory's pretty fragile and it morphs. And what we try and do as humans is we try and come up with a narrative that makes the most sense. So if you're into movie making, you think of it like backroom editing. You've
Mhm.
got all these bits and our brains we're meaning making animals, like we make stories, and we put things in the order that just make the most sense, and they feel very true, but they may not be.
Right.
So what happens under stress neurobiologically is there's the region in our brain where we're encoding the thing that we're seeing and the degree of confidence and assurance that we have with it. And under high stress, what our stress hormones do is they produce a disconnection between those neural regions. So you can be very confident and right. You can be very confident and wrong. You can have no confidence and be right, and you can have no confidence and be absolutely wrong. And the sad part right now is we don't have a good a good proxy, a way of knowing when you listen to an eyewitness whether that would tell you if the story's right or not. So when I've testified in a number of cases, and I said in the absence of external objective data that would match the story, most eyewitness memory for highly stressful events is unreliable, meaning that it changes. We don't know which is true. It could be true, but we don't know because you can't use the person's confidence. But attorneys only put competent witnesses on the stand.
Mm,
So back to your question about the hypnosis and memory, we in training psychiatrists, like we tell them now, don't go digging for memories that people don't already have when they come to see you, um, because we know that by doing that kind of an inquiry, we can create false memories, and false memories become indistinguishable from genuine memories. You can have feelings with them, they can have detail, they can be very vivid. So we generally say we'll work with people if they come in with a memory, and but we don't try and go finding it. And
wow.
it's a field people get pretty charged up about because some people feel very strongly that memories are stored in different places in your body, and that if you don't remember it, it doesn't mean it's not there.
Mm,
And my view is that may be true, but right now we don't know how to tell if what you find is real or not. And given that they're
mm,
usually involved in litigation, you have to be just really, really careful. But I think what I've learned is, memory is it's meant to be useful. It's not really like a library. It's just meant to be good enough. So when we do look at memory for highly stressful events, people are generally right from just about everything you can see from 20 feet away. They're wrong about eye color, the shape of your face, whether you had a beard or not. But I think that's probably because if you have to wait that long to see if the danger is this close to go, wait, it was blue eyes, not brown eyes, you probably wouldn't be very adaptive.
right.
Yeah. So but it's, I think right now there's a really interesting line of investigative work trying to figure out when do you debrief people. My, I would say it's just my personal opinion is I think you should probably have people tell you their story as soon as you can have them sit down and say what happened before they've had a chance to talk to anybody else or see the news or
Mm,
try and piece things together. But there are people who wonder, well, maybe we should have them sleep all night first. Maybe memory gets consolidated. Um,
mm.
yeah,
Seems like
because
even the sleeping would mess it up because your mind, while sleeping, is trying to construct the story with emotions, and then you've developed this big muddy water as well, right?
well, I would agree with you. I think that would be my hunch because I mean, you're weaving stories all night long when you dream, and just because you're asleep, it doesn't mean your brain's not dumping and sorting
Mm.
information. So, yeah, yeah,
It
it's
shows the
challenging.
vulnerability of us too. Like just humans are so vulnerable when it comes to our consciousness and the
Yeah,
that
yeah,
deep hypnotic state. If you if you get people into that suggestible state, which can be very useful for healing, that's what I keep leaning into. Like, all right, it can be used for terrible things, but
yeah.
the
But
best
it's
part of it
good.
is that the meaning making is
Yeah.
here for the feature, not the curse. And
Well,
if you get yourself into these relaxed state, that's where the ketamine therapy can be
yeah,
useful, or all these other
yeah.
psycho or breath work or meditation. It's like, man, that's an amazing place to actually construct a more truthful narrative that's tied
Yeah.
to a positive emotion to heal.
Exactly. Exactly. You can say, look, people go, it's terrible. Your memory's not indelible. I'm like, no, it's a good thing.
It's a
It
feature.
actually is why you can get better.
Right.
Part of your memory can change and you may not bring as much because painful memories have that emotional component. And if memory can change, people can move on,
Yeah.
right, in ways. And like you say, I think it's a double-edged sword, right? But I think it's useful. It's also what makes family reunions so much fun, right? When
Yeah.
you get together and people go, I don't think I remember it that way. People go, no, that's what it was. And they're like, but I think that's the beauty of it. We're communities of storytellers, right?
Right.
That's what helps you with your identity and your meaning and who your family is or who you are. It wasn't really meant for the court
Yeah. Would
when you think about it that way.
You've spent a lot of time studying and working with resiliency and teaching people that, I'm guessing, from what I was reading. And I'm curious if this is a big feature, is that storytelling component, like the logos therapy, or if you want to call it stoicism, or is that a
Exactly.
big feature to it? Is the
Yeah.
restructuring of the narrative with a positive and
Yes.
truthful? Okay.
Absolutely. How you talk to yourself about yourself makes a profound difference in both your mood, your optimism, the way you can then problem solve in the future. And so, to a very significant degree, resilience is intimately linked to that, what we call that self-talk, that narrative you have about yourself. When people identify themselves as the wounded victim,
Victim.
right? If that becomes their identity, that's what they fulfill, and they can't move on from the trauma. When people say, no, I am more than whatever bad thing happened to me, whatever terrible thing somebody else did to me, that does not define me, right? My meaning and my purpose and my definition of myself is bigger than X, right? Whatever happened, that gives people alternative ways of feeling about themselves, connecting to other people, and engaging in the world to do things. And I think there's multiple techniques that help people change that narrative. I mean, the breathing and relaxation and meditation is vital to not being run by your physiology, right?
Hmm.
You say mindfulness, learning that, stuff moves through you rather than you being every thought that's in your head. And you then become less controlled by it and you can become an observer of it. And then you choose what you can act on. So those techniques are extraordinarily valuable. And different people use different combinations of them. As I was talking to some firefighters who work with the FDNY guys, and for some people they're going, I just can't meditate. I'm like, I have a very busy mind. Meditation, like sitting and meditating, isn't something that frees me. from just all the activity in my head, but highly intense aerobic exercise does.
Right.
So, because I can't think of anything else, right? It's that just, and so you need, for other people, it's gardening
Yep.
or beekeeping or anything. I always tell people find something that lets you escape from being caught up in all the turmoil that
Yeah.
goes on. You can have that mindful, that flow state because you're lost in something. You'd be lost in a book. You can be lost in a piece of music. You can be lost in gardening. You can, right? It gets you out of yourself. So I think the challenge, that's what I tell patients, I tell friends of mine, the personal challenge for everybody is to find as many neat ways to do that, right?
Yeah.
Because you're getting more tools, right, in your toolkit to be in charge of your life. So you're not reacting to the world that every possible because you have no control over what other people do, right? And it takes a while for people to believe that no one can make you feel anything, only you can. And but it's all how it's interpreted, right?
Yeah.
And until we learn to then move from the reaction standpoint to just letting it go and observing it and adopting something, um, we tend to live with more anxiety and stress, And then
Yeah.
and it's yeah, I can't say I do it all the time. Every now and then I have, a stretch where I go, yeah, the flow's really good, right?
Yeah.
It's so for me, it's an ongoing self-development process but I find, when you get older, there's many things that just don't worry you
Yeah.
this much anymore. You're like, yeah, I used to worry about that, but in the big scheme of things, that doesn't matter. So I
Yeah.
think the sooner people realize, kind of what matters in your life and what doesn't.
Yeah, that's
I do
wisdom is
think,
aging and realizing that most of your problems
yeah,
were in your imagination or in your head and just lack of perspective or being caught up in the thoughts without being able to pull back, like you said.
and you have a really neat role, like in doing podcasting and things like that, because I think that there's so many unhelpful things in social media that create these worlds in people's heads that are disconnected from their life and have terrible narratives about who they should be, what they should look like, what they should, right? That get them all fired up. And there's so many people selling you products in the form of news to just get you to listen, right? Because
Hmm.
they want your attention, but none of it changes your everyday life, right? And most of it doesn't. Most of it's just noise.
Yeah.
And I think as the sooner people realize that you can actually have a really pleasant like week when you decide which narratives are gonna what you're gonna fill your brain with during the
Hmm.
week. Um,
Absolutely.
I tell my students, I'm like, I check the news once in the morning and I don't look at it the rest of the day.
Yeah.
And because it's funny. I was at the gym working out and I was just observing. I don't think anybody puts their phone down for more than 8 minutes without picking it back up to check. And it's like an addiction. It's really an interesting, um, you have to do your own observation about it, but it's like everybody's on it, everybody's on it. Like no one's just kind of sitting or,
Yeah.
and people comment on that, but then they have to go back and check. And I'm like, it really is, I think, neurobiologically a bit of addiction. You get a dopamine hit every time you find something new, whether it's good for you or not.
Yeah.
So
It's
for
almost
me,
like an implant at this point.
it is, and so for me, part of resilience is about, having less unhelpful stress and anxiety. And I let that go because it doesn't serve any useful purpose in my day-to-day moments. If I want to email someone, I will. If I want to text them, I will. Or if I'm waiting for a message from them, I will. But just the scrolling doesn't help me. Um, yeah, I'd rather read a really good book or watch a fun film or
Yeah.
go do, yeah,
Yeah.
design a new
Unplugging,
product.
right?
Yeah, it's really true.
Yeah.
Uh, but I find that really enhances my ability to like manage stress like appropriately to be useful. Because I think resilience is really making sure there's a good fit. You're adapting successfully to your environment. For me, that's the definition of resilience. I think that when we don't flex with the environment in a way that helps us, then we experience distress.
Yeah.
And that resilience is really learning that art
Yeah.
of how do you go with the flow? Yeah.
Yeah, and it's a practice that's ongoing. And I for myself, I've been a fireman 20 years, so I've been over the years very fascinated with the nature of suffering, self and other in the world. So I got really curious about how do I create more flow in my
Yeah.
life on demand, and flow meaning like that selflessness, timelessness, effortlessness,
Yeah.
and you're more lucid.
Yeah.
And it seems like the underlying thing that I discovered so far, I'm very immature in this journey, but is that that orientation towards the environment that you're talking about needs to have a very powerful and true it's a narrative, and the
Yeah.
underlying narrative should first be that you are having some sort of complex experience with awareness, something's happening from nothing. And so my
Yes.
relationship right off the gate should be some form of gratitude and appreciation for the fact that I'm here and having an experience
Yeah.
versus all of the other things that you can triage. And if
Yeah.
you triage first of like, okay, you are a complex, aware human being navigating a very complex environment with, and you inherited this very complex system, I
Yeah.
always think you should be a little grateful first. And that
Yeah.
gratitude is so good for your consciousness. It's the neurochemicals that come with it. It's a state. It's not just some, thought. But
Yeah.
I
It's not
always
just
think,
a
and
thought.
yeah, you're just recreating narratives, and then as you go, you can look at everything as an opportunity to learn and grow, and it becomes more of a curiosity and a wonder versus fear and scarcity and oh no, I need to. But that just
Exactly.
seems to work so far for me when I'm trying to program myself in a deeper
That's
state.
great.
But
No, that's great because you can stay more, you're staying in a more productive and anabolic state than a catabolic defensive, sort of more breaking things down state neurophysiologically when you do that. I think
yeah,
this, you're making me think when I was talking to the firefighters the other day, I was saying, one of these things that, people talk about burnout, and one of the elements that helps prevent burnout is having a sense of personal accomplishment, like something you're doing is meaningful and that it makes a difference and that it's worthwhile. And it helps buffer. You can be exhausted, you can be even a little cynical, but as long as you believe what I do makes a difference in other people's lives, it helps other people. I save people from fires. I do this, right?
totally.
Um, it counters the negative impact of like just having to work long hours, and doing all that.
Hmm.
And that's where that sense, that's why I always do think that narrative, you have purpose, you have meaning, there's a reason you believe in some things, right?
Totally.
However you, whatever you decide,
Yeah.
there's a goal. Yeah.
Yeah, I think of that Viktor Frankl book, The Man's Search for Meaning, because you picture him in the concentration camps, but he had this huge purpose behind him and his
Yeah.
orientation in those camps. So when I get off a 24-hour shift, I literally will think of that guy. And even if
Yeah.
I'm a little run down, my first response is like, I still feel better than the average American. I have all this vital energy. I've got
Yeah.
more days off and food, shelter, water. I can count your blessings. And then you have this really crazy untapped energy system that gives you it's you can be exhausted but still have incredible vitality by just
Yeah.
flipping the narrative and truly believing in it. So I've been finding that to be the most powerful thing is your meaning and your purpose.
That's so cool. Yeah, it's funny. I was thinking somebody was asking me the other day how you're involved in like all these different things. Part of that for me is what, no matter how many busy things there are, they're exciting to do. There's
Hmm.
because there's things I want to get done. There's
There's
things I think,
fire behind it.
yeah, you have like, I don't know if this is my dress rehearsal in life or not, but I want to try all these different things and do
Yeah.
something. Yeah,
Yeah, because you're passionate and you care and you have this whole, it's driving you in a way.
yeah,
That's cool.
yeah. It's so
Well, I
funny.
know you got to get
All
going,
right,
don't you?
I do. I just, yeah, it's about 11:30, but
Do you mind
this
if I
has been
ask you if
delightful.
you were gonna die today, what would you want to say to the world?
Wow, I would say a couple of things. I say, boy, make sure every day you do something you really love. Do something you love every day with someone you care about. Because any of us could die every day. So that's my motto. You deserve to have something you do do something you enjoy every day with someone who you enjoy. Yeah.
Oh, I love that. I appreciate your time today. It was really fun hearing some of your
Thanks so
journey.
much. It's a real pleasure to meet you. I'm really glad you
Absolutely.
reached out. Yeah, it's delightful. Thank you.
Absolutely. All right. Have a good rest of your day.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to the episode. Be sure to subscribe to the show on Spotify, YouTube, and iTunes, and rate the show. I hope you enjoyed the episode.
What we call reality is in fact nothing more than a culturally sanctioned and linguistically reinforced hallucination.